Hello and welcome back to the Good Leader Podcast. I'm Will Vanderhart. It's great to have you here today, but especially great because on the podcast today we've got Cheryl Donaldson. It's an absolute privilege to have her. Cheryl has been in private practice and therapeutic work for over 30 years, and she's got heart for the family and heart for people in ministry. And Cheryl, massive welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just want to say a bit about yourself in opening.
So my master's was in clinical psychology, and I started off working on young life staff. So I started off working with kids and families, and just gave me a heart to equip people with the tools they need to be able to address the issues that they have in their homes and their works and everything.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So we've had some really interesting conversations. You've got a real heart for the church and particularly sort of seeing leaders struggle. And I know you've been a huge support to many over the years. I'd love just to share a few insights on some of the common themes that you've seen in kind of leader struggles, the kind of battles of everyday ministry. And, maybe some of those folk who've ended up in needing therapeutic work and any common themes that you see that we could prepare leaders in advance to address.
So I think the one thing that I see the most is leaders not asking for help soon enough. So when we experience trauma, we get dysregulated. The one thing we want to do as soon as we get dysregulated is become regulated again. But usually when we're doing that, we're just kind of pushing things down, and we don't want to ask for help because we don't want to feel that way again, and we don't want to have to, go through that again. So what I have seen over the years is that by the time they come to me, we could have done so much work that would have been easier earlier on. So that would be that's the theme, to definitely come in. And when you're beginning to see your body just become anxious, dysregulated, not sleeping, experiencing all those experiences of depression, anxiety, reach out to someone for help. The earlier the better is, I guess, what I've seen.
Amazing. We've talked a little bit about trauma. We're both very interested in trauma. You're hugely experienced in the field, and I found it fascinating spending time hearing from you of your experience working with people in trauma. Trauma is becoming an increasingly kind of hot or interested topic amongst leaders as they become aware of trauma not necessarily being a big T event, but actually being kind of low-level trauma or cumulative trauma. And sometimes in Christian ministry, we talk about vicarious trauma, kind of becoming traumatized through the traumas other people are experiencing, and then kind of bringing into your pastoral table. I'd love to hear a bit from you about, if you could unpack dysregulation a little bit for us, that'd be helpful, and about how you sort of frame trauma in the kind of bigger narrative of people's lives.
Right. So trauma can be big trauma or little trauma or cumulative trauma. That's a great way to put that. It's when we have traumatic experiences. And trauma really is when we experience something that we don't have coping skills for. So when we experience something when we're young, that's a large event that's not processed, it equates to then trauma because we don't have the skills or know what to do. It's sort of an out of the ordinary event. And if parents don't walk through that with us, we then kind of bury those feelings and we don't know exactly what to do with them, that they're there. And they come out later, they come out at different times. And so that's, when we describe trauma, it's really not having the coping skills to be able to manage the experience at hand. So when that's cumulative, it begins to impact the body. When it begins to impact the body, we have a kind of dysregulated nervous system, and it reacts to all kinds of things that are coming in, even things that we can't even connect to something else. We get anxiety, sometimes we have panic attacks, sometimes it's not sleeping, sometimes it's not being able to stop thinking about something, sort of ruminating about things. So that's what I see in my practice, and it's really important to unpack what did we learn growing up about dealing with things that overwhelmed us? What did we learn about that? When were there experiences that overwhelmed us? What did that feel like? How did you try to solve that? What does that look like? It's a very problem solving. It's both problem solving as well as insight oriented to understand, how do we get here? Like, how did you get to the place where your body is now sort of responding to things and you don't know why?
That's really such a helpful way of describing it. And I think many people listening to this podcast will be thinking, oh, that's a kind of a eureka moment where you're thinking, oh my goodness, that's a reflection of my experience. Trauma can feel quite terrifying. I'm sure a lot of listeners will have read Bessel van der Kolk's amazing book, Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't read it and you're listening to this podcast, I really recommend it. So of encouragement for that. But I guess beyond that, there's a lot of terror around reading something like Bessel's book. You hear about these kind of very dynamic stories, these very terrifying stories. What about low-level trauma? Should people feel terrified? And
Mm.
and actually, is there hope for people who've been traumatized in ministry?
Yes. Um, well, if you feel terrified, you feel terrified. That's really that's important. If you should you feel terrified is, why is this happening? Why is this happening to my body? And if you do feel that, there's usually ways to look at that, understand that, and have healing from that. Really, at the end of the day. So, if you're feeling terrified, the most important thing is not to push that down, but then to go and talk to somebody about that. That's really somebody that will understand and be able to give you feedback on what that is. I loved how Carrie said yesterday, go to someone that you trust that can say, not give you an easy answer for it, but really listen to you and help you to understand. Because trauma can be terrifying because it doesn't make sense. And that's really why it can be so terrifying. So you want to go to a trusted person that you feel like will help you make sense out of it. And there's so much hope within trauma, but that where you become hopeless is when you keep it inside and you don't bring it out. Then it becomes even more scary. It just becomes bigger and bigger.
That's really, really helpful advice. Now, a lot of leaders that I know struggle with a feeling of guilt around having need. And many of them ended up in the kind of caring profession because they want to help others, they want to care for others, but they really struggle to care for themselves. It can feel quite overwhelming and terrifying, even just acknowledging, okay, this could be my problem. And then secondarily, even more overwhelming when you start thinking about actually opening the door to that.
Yeah.
And as you've said, so important to begin to bring trauma out into the open, to really practice some self-compassion. Could you describe a little bit about practices of self-compassion and how we help leaders to get into the door as far as therapy is concerned, which I think is, I mean, I've been in ministry for 20 years and I've had so much therapy. I found it so helpful and life-giving. And I kind of want other leaders to kind of catch on to the joy of actually learning more about yourself. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah. I think therapy is really it's hard to walk in the doors of a therapist's office. I often say, at the end of my first session, I'll say, what was the most helpful thing today? And they'll say, just come in the door. And I thought, yeah, that's really actually the biggest thing. But therapy can offer everyone a place that's safe and sacred and protected, and a place where you can walk in and kind of unpack things and close the door. But it's also really important to find someone that is safe, that you feel if it doesn't work or if it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes there's different reasons why it can feel uncomfortable, but if it really feels uncomfortable, like, maybe this isn't a good fit, you can always find somebody else to go and talk to, and that's a really good thing. Self-care, there's so many different things we can do with self-care. We all need, for lack of a better word, discharge. And we have that dysregulated system and we can get dysregulated during the day where we just get stressed and uncomfortable and different. We need those practices in our life, whether it's through prayer, whether it's through exercise, whether it's through time alone, quite any way that we discharge, yoga, things that we need to kind of release the stresses of the day. That's a really good self-practice. And sometimes when we get in the role of that, we can discharge some of that just excess energy that we have. The next thing that we need for self-compassion is to understand, why am I feeling this guilt? What is this? Where does this come from? Is this helpful to me now? Is it not helpful? Help me to understand where this comes from and why I developed it, and if it's helpful now or not. And as we begin to understand that, we'll begin to develop compassion on ourselves and just compassion on others as opposed to criticism on ourselves, which is also important to understand where that came from. But that sort of understanding of ourselves and why we respond in ways that we respond is really an important piece of just self-care and self-compassion.
Okay. So these things really go hand in hand. When you work with a therapist to understand maybe where some of your pathological guilt has come from, why you're overworking, why you're not engaging in self-care, propagates a narrative where you're enabled to actually begin to take steps towards greater self-care, which means you need less therapy and you can actually function better in ministry. So the sort of both the action and the understanding of the necessity for action form the core part of transformation where trauma is concerned.
Yeah.
When you kind of look at the church today in the context of an increasingly kind of hostile social environment, and you see the pressure that leaders are under in terms of all of the additional work of the leader in terms of, the social ministry of the church, the important work of safeguarding and the important work of accountancy and financial management. When you see all these things happening concurrently, and you were trying to prepare leaders for the future in ministry, which isn't, in a sense, hasn't got the same cadence as historic ministry. What advice would you give to a leader who's stepping out into that very frenetic, very highly charged, and very demanding environment?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is community. That's really Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot about community and connecting to others, feeling cared for by others, but people that will tell you the truth, that will come alongside you, that you're safe. Sometimes as leaders, we tend to be lone rangers and kind of go out on our own, and yet surrounding yourself with people that you feel safe with, that will talk with you, that will give you the truth, that will not leave you or judge you. It's really surrounding yourself with those people and spending time with them and really making sure that their priority in your life is key. Your family and then friends that can come alongside you. It don't have to be in your same town, but it has to be people that you can reach out to that can support you.
That's such good advice. You've referenced to me a couple of leaders you've been walking alongside for a really long time. One of your friends became a bishop, and you talked fondly about relationship with them. And you know a lot of leaders who have really stayed the course over the years and are faithful to Jesus, still have a lively spiritual fervor, have great marriage, have good relationships with their children. You've also known a number of leaders who've really struggled for whom things haven't ended up that well. What do you notice about those leaders who you've been friends with for a long time, about the ways in which they've looked after themselves and the people around them that's made them distinctive for the long haul? And what would you sort of want to bottle, if you like,
Yes.
from the example of their ministry?
Yeah. I think the one thing would be authenticity and the people that can be real with other people and don't feel like they need to be on all the time, but they have those people in their lives that they can be authentic with and surround themselves with those people. I think, again, it's that community, it's that validating of community and knowing that you don't need to be perfect. I loved when Kate Bowler was talking this morning about just that imperfection and being comfortable with that and being comfortable in that place. Then you have really a safe place within yourself that you can be yourself and you can surround yourself with people that can accept that and foster that. And that authenticity, I think, is the key.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. If you can live your life and ministry in your own skin
Yes,
confidently,
yes,
then there's a
exactly,
comfortable place to
exactly.
be. So it's been such a helpful conversation, and I'm thinking about some of the leaders I'm working with regularly who do struggle with that sense of imposter syndrome. And I know you deal with that a lot in therapy. We have here, I'm sure, probably in the States as well, the kind of fake it to make it mentality, which for me is a nightmare because it's such a gilded cage. The thing is, it works, so people do fake it and then they make it. But when they've made it, what do they do then? You can't really turn around and tell everyone that you're a fraud and this is who you really are. So you're really stuck at that point. And I feel like there's a real hunger, if you like, in society, maybe in the church, for those kind of superhero leaders who get everything right. It takes a lot of courage to be authentic, doesn't it? What would you say to a leader who felt kind of trapped by their own propagated self-image, by the kind of expectations of the people around them?
Yeah, and that's that whole idea of building up that trauma. Really, at the end of the day, that you're trying to you're living out a glittering image that's not as a shell, and so ultimately, you're not really connecting with others in a way that's meaningful to you, and eventually, it won't be meaningful to others because you don't have anything else to give. You just don't have anything left in the tank, and so eventually, we see burnout and all those different things. But that that decision not to be a glittering image, that decision to know that your imperfections and your story really is going to connect with others. And the more we can embrace our own story and the more we can embrace who we are, just little steps along the way, the more the more people are going to be able to connect with us and we're going to get our own what's what I'm looking for, our own just needs met even more because we're going to be more connected to people because they're actually connecting to us.
Yeah.
So
Oh, so helpful. The relief of being able to be yourself, right,
that's
in
right.
ministry with
That's
other
right.
people.
Yeah.
Sure, I feel like I could be here all day with you listening to the incredible wisdom that you're sharing right now. Sadly, we've got to wrap this episode up, but I'd love to get you back on the podcast at some point. We'd love to have you again, just pressing into this really important area of trauma. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, this short episode of the Good Leader podcast today with Cheryl Donaldson. Such a great amount of wisdom and insight into the experience of trauma and vicarious trauma in Christian leadership. And we're going to put a few notes into the chat under this podcast so you can think of a few questions to apply to your own life to make some great decisions for self-care and authenticity in ministry. Wish you all the very best. God bless you. Have a really great day.